You ever get one of those calls where your gut just screams, don't go? But you go anyway because it's someone you know, maybe a mate, maybe someone you've had a few pints with before. That's what happened to Paul Quinn. 21 years old, born and raised in Cullyhanna, a quiet border town where everyone knows everyone and secrets travel faster than the news. He got a call one day, simple, harmless, someone needed a hand, maybe to settle something, maybe to talk. Nothing dramatic. But that call, it became his death sentence. Because what Paul didn't know was that he was walking straight into a trap, a setup waiting for him just across the border in County Monaghan. And here's where it gets dark, like really dark. This isn't some random mugging or bar fight gone wrong. This was planned, organized, executed with military precision. The kind of thing that makes you wonder who had that kind of power to pull it off and get away with it for almost 2 decades. Ireland still whispers about it. 17 years later, people in that border region don't even like saying his name too loudly. Not because they've forgotten, but because fear still lives there. Fear of talking, fear of knowing too much. This isn't just a murder story. It's a story about trust, betrayal, and the terrifying price of silence. Alright, let's meet the people at the center of this mess. First up, Paul Quinn, 21 years old, a young lad from Cullyhanna, County Armagh. The kind of guy you'd probably see helping his dad fix something in the yard or driving a van through the back roads with music way too loud. He wasn't some big city gangster or political rebel, he was just a worker. Drove lorries, worked construction, did his thing. Then there's his parents, Breege and Stephen Quinn, and if you've ever seen them in interviews, you can feel that fire in their eyes. They've spent years doing what no parent should have to do, begging for justice for their son, knocking on every politician's door, reminding Ireland that their boy existed. They're not just grieving, they're fighting. You can almost tell they've aged decades since it happened, but they still refuse to let this story die. Now let's talk about the shadows around Paul's story. The whispers, the names people mention only in pubs when they're sure no one's listening. Local men, some said to have connections or old connections to the era. The kind of people everyone in the area knows of but doesn't really talk about. A few of them were supposedly there that night, some as lookouts, others as the ones holding the iron bars. But here's the catch, none of their names ever stuck. Nobody's been convicted. It's all rumors, politics, and fear holding hands in the dark. Everyone knew there was tension brewing, border politics, personal grudges, local egos. It was a small community where loyalty can get messy real fast. You cross the wrong person and suddenly you're the target of something much bigger than yourself. So yeah, Paul Quinn, 21 years old, just caught in the wrong web at the wrong time. And if that sounds like the start of something bigger, that's because it is. Paul Quinn was the kind of lad who worked hard, didn't cause trouble, and liked to laugh. He drove lorries, helped on construction sites, earned his keep. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Except he lived in the kind of place where politics, family names, and grudges all mixed together like a bad stew Cullyhanna, right on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And if you know anything about that area, you know borders there aren't just lines on a map, they're fault lines. History runs deep in the soil, and everyone knows whose side their grandfather was on. Now there'd been a bit of tension brewing around Paul. Little things at first, arguments, scuffles, the kind of small town nonsense that gets big when pride's on the line. People whispered that he'd had run-ins with some fellas who still liked to think of themselves as soldiers of the old days. Some folks said Paul got into a fight at a pub and decked the wrong person, someone with family in the local era crowd. Others said he'd been warned to stay in line. You know how gossip goes, every retelling adds another layer. But the weird part? Paul didn't seem scared. He told people he wasn't going to be intimidated. He had that kind of stubborn streak, the quiet kind that says, "You can threaten me all you want, I'm still living my life." He'd laugh it off, say things like, "I've done nothing wrong." Still, you could feel the tension thickening around him. Neighbors noticed strange cars they didn't recognize. Friends said certain people stopped saying hello. And in a town that small, silence is louder than shouting. Then came the call. Someone he knew told him to come by a shed just across the border near Tullicora in County Monaghan. The story was that a few lads wanted to talk things out, maybe clear the air. Nothing major, just a chat. Paul agreed. Why wouldn't he? These were people he'd grown up around. What he didn't know was that the stage was already set and he'd just been handed the starring role in his own execution. Paul didn't think twice about it. He grabbed his jacket, told his parents he was heading out for a quick chat, and left. Just another day, another errand, nothing worth worrying about. The farm he was heading to sat across the border in County Monaghan, quiet, isolated, the kind of place you'd drive past without even noticing. When he arrived, the air must have felt off. You know that feeling when your stomach twists but your brain hasn't caught up yet? That's probably how it felt. Inside that shed, people were waiting. Not friends, not peacekeepers. A group of men dressed in boiler suits, gloves, and masks, the type of outfit you wear when you plan on leaving no trace. Some reports said there were around 10 of them. Some outside keeping watch, others inside holding weapons, iron bars, wooden clubs studded with nails. Everything about it was planned. Who would bring him, who would block the doors, who would swing first. Paul walked in thinking he was about to clear the air. Maybe argue a bit, maybe shake hands, go home. Instead, the doors shut behind him, and that was it. The talk was never meant to happen. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't a fight. It was an ambush, pure, cold revenge disguised as a meeting. And once that first hit landed, it didn't stop. They beat him for nearly half an hour. Half an hour. Try sitting still for that long and you'll realize just how endless it feels. Every bone below his neck was shattered. They broke him so completely that even doctors couldn't believe he was still breathing when he was found. The men left him there, on the cold concrete, barely alive. Whoever was supposed to teach him a lesson had gone far beyond that. When rescuers got there, they rushed him to Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital in Drogheda, but the injuries were too much. Within hours, Paul Quinn was gone. A young man, 21 years old, beaten to death on the border, and nobody ever charged for it. Want me to move to the next part? When the accusations start flying, the political storm begins, and everyone scrambles to shift the blame. When Paul's death hit the news, it was like someone dropped a grenade into Irish politics. The Quinn family wasted no time. They came out swinging. They said straight up, this wasn't just a personal feud. They believed men linked to the era were behind it. Not officially acting under orders maybe, but people who still carried that power, that untouchable aura left over from the Troubles. It was a huge deal. Because we're not talking about some forgotten era, this was 2007. Ireland was trying to move forward, shake off the ghosts of paramilitary control. So the idea that someone could be beaten to death by men connected to that world, it hit a nerve. Sinn Féin, the political party associated with the Republican movement, rushed to deny everything. They said the era wasn't involved, that it was just criminal elements. But then a clip surfaced, a local Sinn Féin minister, Conor Murphy, calling Paul a smuggler and criminal. Imagine being the victim's family, hearing that right after your son was buried. It wasn't just cruel, it painted him as the reason for his own death. Years later, Murphy apologized, said he regretted the comment. But damage like that doesn't really fade. It sticks. It shapes how people talk about the case. And in small communities, once a rumor has a political logo on it, it's basically gospel. Even the House of Lords got dragged into it. A member named Lord Laird claimed senior era figures, including Thomas Slab Murphy, might have been consulted before the attack. Now, nobody ever proved that, but just hearing it said out loud kept the story alive. It turned the Quinn murder into something much bigger, a test of whether the new Ireland could really stand up to its old shadows. And through all that noise, the Quinn family just kept showing up. Every interview, every anniversary, standing there with Paul's picture, repeating the same words, "We just want the truth." But truth's tricky when everyone's got something to lose by telling it. The investigation kicked off fast. Both the guards down south and the peace Nye up north jumped on it. Two jurisdictions, one crime scene split by a border that's barely a road sign apart. They raided farms, questioned locals, followed up on every whisper in pubs, and at first it looked like something might actually happen. Over the years, 23 people were arrested, 14 by the guards, 9 by the peace nigh. That sounds impressive until you realize not a single one of them was ever charged. Every time someone was brought in, questioned, maybe held for a bit, they walked right back out the door. There was a guy in his 50s arrested in Monaghan in 2016, released without charge. Another in his early 20s was picked up under terrorism laws a few years before that. Same story. In the Quinn case, everyone gets arrested, nobody gets blamed. The guards did everything they could, at least on paper. They collected around 200 pieces of evidence from the scene and surrounding areas. Items from cars, clothing, even stuff dug out of the ground. All boxed up and logged, waiting for a forensic miracle that never quite came. Years later, they reopened the case to retest everything using modern DNA tech. But as of today, still nothing that points to a name. The more time passed, the colder the trail got. Witnesses went quiet. People forgot details. Others just flat out refused to talk. It's the kind of silence that doesn't come from ignorance, it comes from fear. Because out there in those border towns, people still remember what happens when you talk too much. Every anniversary, Paul's parents remind the world that not a single conviction has been made. And every year, the headlines say the same thing: fresh appeal for information. It's like Groundhog Day, except the monster isn't a talking groundhog. It's a wall of silence that nobody dares break. That's the tragedy of it. The evidence is there, the police are there, even the suspects are there. But justice? Nowhere to be found. Fear, that's the word that hangs over everything in this story. You can almost feel it in the air when people from that border region talk about Paul Quinn. They lower their voices. They look over their shoulders. Not because they're paranoid, but because they've seen what happens when you talk too loudly. In South Armagh, people have long memories. This was the heartland during the Troubles. Everyone knows someone who used to be involved. Some still are. So when Paul was murdered and his parents started pointing fingers, most of the community went quiet. Not out of cruelty, out of pure survival instinct. When power wears no uniform, you learn not to ask questions. The Quinns didn't care. Breege and Stephen went public. They gave interviews, they spoke to politicians, they begged people to speak up. Breege said once, "It's no easier today than it was that evening." You can hear the exhaustion in her voice. 17 years of fighting walls made of fear, and those walls are thick. The locals know things. They have to. You can't get 10 men in a shed, weapons ready, lookouts posted, without somebody noticing. But notice doesn't mean confess. Because silence there isn't just habit, it's protection. Protection from retaliation, from shame, from reopening wounds that were supposed to be healed after peace came to Ireland. So the Quinns stand mostly alone. Each year they hold a memorial. Each year politicians tweet their condolences. Each year nobody is charged. The whole thing has turned into a ritual of frustration, grief on repeat. That's the twisted part about the story. The violence ended in that shed, but the fear never did. It just changed shape from clubs and iron bars into whispers and silence. And silence in this story has done more damage than any weapon ever could. In the years after Paul's murder, the investigation never stopped, it just kept looping through cycles of hope and heartbreak. Every few years, the guards would step forward again with fresh leads, new technology, and renewed promises that this time things might finally move. Around 2021, they began retesting evidence with upgraded DNA tools, all those old exhibits boxed up for over a decade, clothes, cars, fibers, and bits of debris from that Monaghan farm shed. The hope was that technology might do what people couldn't speak the truth that everyone else was too scared to say out loud. They worked alongside the peace night, retracing witness statements, checking mobile records, cross-border activity, all of it. It sounded impressive, but the truth, it didn't change much. They still hit that same invisible wall made of fear and silence. The Quinn family stayed in the media spotlight, pushing every politician, every party, especially Sinn Féin, to acknowledge what really happened. They even challenged Conor Murphy again to meet them face to face, to admit publicly that Paul was not what he'd once called him. Murphy apologized, but Breege Quinn didn't let it rest. She said, "Words are fine, but justice is better." Despite all the frustration, she never stopped believing someone will eventually talk. Every anniversary, she stands outside holding Paul's picture, hoping guilt might finally outweigh fear in someone's heart. And that's the strange thing about this case. The guards are still officially investigating it. Files are still open. Forensics still ongoing. Leads still active. But without voices, there's no story. Without witnesses, there's no justice. So the question hangs in the air like fog over the borderlands. How do you solve a murder when the truth itself is too afraid to come out? And here's where it all comes full circle. Paul Quinn's murder was supposed to send a message that no one crosses the wrong people and walks away. But 17 years later, it's sending a different message entirely. That in Ireland, sometimes fear has a longer lifespan than justice. His killers still out there, maybe living normal lives, maybe sitting in the same pubs, laughing about football scores. That's the part that sticks, not the brutality, but the normality that followed it. The Quinn family kept their son's face in the headlines when everyone else wanted the story buried. They didn't have political power or big connections, just stubbornness and heartbreak, and somehow that's what's kept this case alive. Every few years, the guards make another appeal, dust off the files, promise fresh momentum. It's like clockwork. A press release, a quote about hope, a new forensic angle, then silence again. You could almost set your watch by it. The truth is, Paul Quinn didn't just die in that shed, justice did too. What's left is the echo, the silence, the kind that makes people turn their heads when his name comes up. And that's the haunting bit. 17 years later, the fear that killed him is still doing its job. Nobody talks, nobody names names, nobody steps forward. So yeah, maybe Paul was beaten to death once, but his story is still being killed slowly every single day that nobody speaks up. And the scariest part, it's not the monsters in the shadows, it's the silence that protects them.